I've cleared my work schedule.
Yep, taking a half day from work.
We need to map out our child's entire future.
I mean, do you think he has a future in baseball?
You're right. Shut it down.
And then there's basketball.
He doesn't even have a step back three yet.
Shut it down.
He does love that improv comedy class.
Kim, I'm gonna improv that I didn't hear that.
We need to shut that down.
One thing only from now on, soccer.
My self-worth is directly tied to my child's success.
I mean, obviously.
What kind of extravagant training gear can we get?
Recovery compression sleeve.
Infrared sauna blanket.
High power muscle massager.
Foam roller.
Does it vibrate or have like a Bluetooth?
No.
That's not very extravagant, Kim.
Here's a team schedule. Whoa. It looks like tournaments every weekend for the next 3 months.
And practices every night?
And the coach recommends private lessons if you have time.
What is that, like a guy coming over and saying, kick the ball?
And that's gonna help?
All that training may not work, but it is expensive.
The more expensive it is, the more pressure we'll put on our kid.
That's a formula for success.
Will he have time for school?
He's fine, he's smart.
Okay, pay the team fee, buy the uniform.
Let's cash out all our vacation time and do this.
Welcome to Essential Coaching Conversations with Kyle and Asim.
The real, relevant, necessary conversations to help you navigate coaching, teaching, learning, and life.
Coach, welcome in to episode 46 of Essential Coaching Conversations. This is the Liddell Betts episode. Liddell Betts, former running back for the Washington football team, now known as the Washington Commanders, back in, I think it was like the 2010s, maybe the early 2000s-ish. Now I believe he's the running backs coach at Iowa, which is pretty cool. I didn't realize that until I looked it up today. So Liddell Betts, shout out to you. Had a fairly okay career. In the burgundy and gold, but certainly not anything to write home about. He's just a number 46 that I remember from my childhood / teens / maybe in my 20s. I don't remember when he actually played, but I just remember watching him in the some of the worst days of football in our nation's capital. So, those memories are seared into my brain forever. But what I do know is that we still managed to beat the Cowboys fairly regularly. So throwing it to you, Kyle, who is your number 46 for this episode?
My number 46 is Lee Arthur Smith of Jamestown, Louisiana. Went to Castor High School in Bienville Parish. And I first learned about Lee Smith because of one of the very first assistant coaches that I ever hired was one Tyler Warren, who's a really, really great friend of mine who went to Castor High School, and we worked at Louisiana Tech together as managers and grad assistants. And then he was an assistant coach with me at Cedar Creek for years. And we've been really great friends ever since. And then a fantasy football league together. And I remember him telling me about Lee Smith being from Castor. And Lee is a Hall of Famer now from, I think, a couple of classes ago. He finally got in, probably deserved to get in a long time ago, led the major leagues in saves until Trevor Hoffman broke that. And I remember reading at one point, he was considered like the greatest one-inning pitcher in Major League Baseball history. Big guy, like 6'6", 250 through like upper 90s, and was used as a closer, played for the Cubs, Red Sox, kind of bounced around the league towards the end of his career, and then again finally got into the Hall of Fame. And then I believe he also spent a little time working for the San Francisco Giants, which was tied him back to Shreveport, Louisiana, where our Shreveport Captains used to be, and they've long gone. And that's a really great memory for me and a lot of people in the Shreveport-Bossier area as kids, going to Captains games and getting ice cream in the little helmets and catching foul balls and all that kind of stuff. And so I thought that was a pretty cool, kind of local yet nostalgic, number 46 here. So the Lee Smith episode.
When you said that you had a number 46 prepared, I was prepared to be surprised, and I have no idea who you're talking about, but that's an amazing story. And I'm glad you shared that with all of us.
Seven-time All-Star.
How many times?
7-time All-Star, led the majors in saves like 4 or 5 seasons. was always kind of in the running for a Cy Young. And the way I remember kind of his story was like in the majors, they were kind of changing the way relief pitchers were used, where they were starting to use them less and less and less. And so his numbers and stuff were not going to ever be inflated because he only got to pitch so many innings. But he was extremely dominant with the opportunities that he did have. And if you drive through Castor, I believe they've got like some Lee Smith, home of Lee Smith, kind of like signage and things like that through a little small town in Bienville Parish. So really cool.
That is pretty cool. That is pretty cool. And I want to, you and I talked about this a little bit earlier, but we want to shout out one of our new listeners, Monique LeBlanc. She is the head coach at Brown University, the head women's basketball coach. Brown University is actually like 10 minutes from my house, and got a chance to connect with Coach, and lo and behold, she is a listener of our podcast. And so I told her we'd shout her out today, and holding true to my promise to Coach Mo that we appreciate you listening, and anybody else out there that's a new listener, or even and especially our old listeners. Not for nothing, you and I discussed this a little while ago that like here recently, some of the valleys of our listening audience. So like when we look at our analytics and see the numbers of people who are listening, our valleys are now where our peaks used to be. Which I think is just indicative of the level of growth that our pod has continued to have, but also that we do have a pretty loyal listener base. And for that, we're really thankful. We try really hard to bring you all really, really good content. And, I'm always still amazed that anybody listens, simply because like you and I are I still think of us as two random guys that just decided to start having these conversations and then ended up recording them several years later. And, every time we're looking for a pod topic, or we're looking for something that's going on, it's literally from things that are happening in our lives. And we know that there's people that can relate to what we're talking about. And so we're just really thankful that people are taking the time. Coach Mo, shout out to you for being a new listener. Hopefully you get to catch up here relatively quickly. I know that your off season is super busy, but everybody's is getting busier and busier and busier. But thank you all for taking the time to listen. And so, as we jump into this week's episode, and you can sort of hear it, I think, in both of our voices. This is Essential Coaching at Night. And it's been a long day, but I think we'd be remiss if we did not at least bring something to the table about what's going on right now, it being like late June, getting into July, which is big prime time recruiting for all sports, but particularly basketball. And it's this idea of, are you getting exposure or are you being exposed? And so you can see that in the title. And I think that that's a fairly like straightforward way of naming what it is we're going to talk about today and what the conversation that we're going to have. And both of us have numerous thoughts, and both of us playing different roles in this process as well. Like I think, Kyle having been a high school coach, I'm a high school coach now. I was a college coach a month ago. I think Kyle having worked within Division I athletics now for the last couple years, and just kind of seeing, and also Kyle, you having a young person in your life, right? You have like a daughter who's going to be interested in doing stuff, right? Whether it's arts, whether it's dance, whether it's sports, any of those things. And here recently, even just participating in the first ever women's basketball scholastic period and seeing what that was like, and the difference between that and watching the same players play for their AAU teams, and just like how mind-boggling it is how different some of these things are. And I think we'd be crazy not to talk about it from the standpoint of like, what's all this really for? Is there an inherent level of competition myth that exists? And this is sort of a tie-in to something we talked about. Probably, I think you looked it up just before this in episode 4 in the rest and recovery episodes. And then also last week in the competition episodes. So some of this may be a little bit repetitive in terms of like things we've said in the past, but we're looking through it through the lens of exposure, getting exposed, collegiate recruiting, trying to improve your game over the summer and have opportunities to continue to play the game you like to play, whether that's basketball, volleyball, baseball, soccer. It doesn't matter. They're all the same, right? All of these sort of money making opportunities for people who are, you know, using youth sports as a vehicle to make money, whether these are things like ID camps, whether these are things like, you know, we got to get kids to our camp so we can make a supplemental budget, AAU tournaments, non-scholastic tournaments, random things that happen in a barn on the side of the road. I mean, like, you and I have seen it all, right? And I think there's also a level of, and you used a great analogy, and I'll let you share that. But you know, you being down there in Louisiana and having your teams at Simsboro, I even think about the access piece and how many of your guys had access to some of these opportunities that may be afforded to other people that they perhaps couldn't have access to. You know, not playing for a sneaker team or whatever it is, and you had dudes on your team, right? And so when we think about like even the gentleman you shared who was a 7-time All-Star in the MLB coming down from Louisiana, how well recruited are places like Louisiana and Mississippi and Alabama and things like that, where they're kind of off the beaten path, and some of these kids aren't going to the places they should be going. But then there's kids from places that aren't on the beat, are not off the beaten path, and they're going to certain places to try to get exposure, and they're just getting exposed. So we're going to talk about all of that stuff today. But I want to throw it to you to start us off with the analogy that you used right before we hit record. And I think it'll ring a bell for a lot of people and kind of set the stage for a great conversation.
Yeah, my mind goes to good, better, best, right? With a lot of these things that we talk about, viewing this through the lens. And I think there are going to be some people out there that would argue like, well, it's better to have these opportunities than no opportunities at all. Like the growth of youth sport and the growth of AAU or the growth of travel ball, the growth of 7-on-7 is giving kids more opportunities to, you know, get off the couch, get out of the house, do some good things, stay out of trouble, you know, get opportunities to be seen, all that kind of stuff. And yes, is there value in some of that? Sure, absolutely there is. But should we just accept it as is and not try to ask certain questions and, you know, get better in areas where we feel like we could get better? Are there certain people out there who are taking advantage of these opportunities? Absolutely. And so I think that's where the sort of the interesting part of these conversation lies is like, yeah, we can say that there is some good, but what can we do to make these things better? And then, you know, potentially sort of the best version of whatever that is. And so as we were talking about this before we hit record, my mind went to a couple of things. It went back to those episodes 3 and 4, where we talked about rest and recovery and sort of the overuse of bodies in youth sport. And I believe back in those episodes, we shared an article about Dr. James Andrews sort of lamenting the fact that he shouldn't be so busy doing ACLs and Tommy Johns and all this on youth kids. Like young bodies should not break down like this. And sort of what are the alternatives for that? So from a rest and recovery viewpoint, which again, you know, if you go back and listen to those episodes at 3 and 4, but also tying into the very last episode we just did in competition and how, where are we going for our competition? And that's the analogy you were sort of alluding to. I had a conversation on a golf trip to Alabama that I got to go on last week. And in the car ride, we were just talking about, you know, hobbies and whatnot and fishing. And, you know, we're driving through Mississippi and Alabama and go past these cool little areas. And then golf courses that we played on had some really great, I mean, not great, but water, a lot of water, which was trouble for the golfing, but it's great for like fishing and wildlife and all that. And just kind of like, oh, I bet you could go out there and catch some great fish, right? Like, oh, it'd be awesome to go over there. And, you know, as the golf was piling up and the double bogeys and triple bogeys are piling up, like, oh, let's just go kind of fishing and just kind of relax. So that kind of led one thing to another. And it's this idea that like, if there are two piers, two different areas where you could fish, whatever pier you're standing on, like you don't just drop your bait or your cork like right into the water. You got to cast it, right? It feels like you're fishing if you cast your rod and reel way out into the water, because then you get to reel it in, you get to kind of wait and anticipate you're doing something. It's a little more active than just sitting there with a cane pole in the water. So if there's two docks, one on the left and one on the right, and you're standing on the right, you're going to cast across over to the left. But the person that's fishing on the left dock, what do they feel like they have to do? They feel like they have to cast as well. And so they cast over to the right side of the dock. So in reality, you're both fishing in the same places, but it feels more like you're fishing because you're getting to cast that rod and reel and throw it out there and kind of wait. When in reality, you could just drop your line right into the water and coach speak, warning coming, just be where your feet are and fish right there. Why do we feel like we have to go somewhere to search for that competition? And I think part of this FOMO involved in youth travel sport, whether, again, like you said, whether it be basketball, football, baseball, 7-on-7, softball, whatever, it's like the further we travel from home, the more competition we get to see. The further we get away from home, the more likely we are to really see what somebody else has. When in reality, we likely could have more true competition. And again, kind of shout out to last episode, right in our home gym, right in our own park, playing 21 in our own dadgum driveway with the neighborhood kids. We would get more value out of that, more reps, more competition, more actual development by just dropping the cane pole in the water where our feet are, as opposed to feeling like we have to cast halfway across the lake to just quote unquote feel like we're fishing, feel like we're competing. And, at Simsboro, like we tried to always find the tournament away just because you want to play somebody different. I get that. But it was like anytime, we would play a team from Texas, it was just like they had automatically were going to be good because they were from Texas. But you know what that Texas team was thinking? That the team from Louisiana is automatically good just because they're from some other state. When in reality, they could have been garbage. And we see that a lot of times, like with Louisiana high school football, our teams here will go play somebody from Mississippi or Florida or Georgia or whatever. And chances are those teams are good. And again, there's nothing wrong with mixing it up and, trying to play somebody new and all of that kind of stuff. But when you start to do it on the scale of every weekend throughout your entire summer, and you're just traveling for the sake of traveling to rack up hotel points and basically take these little mini vacations that are not cheap at all in the name of getting exposure and development, what are we really doing at that point? Who's really benefiting from it? And it's typically not the kids who are playing in the game. It's definitely not the kids who are sitting on a bench, not playing in the game. It's the people who are hosting these tournaments and putting this on. They're the ones that are benefiting from it, or maybe the coach who is benefiting from it. I would be willing to bet you there's a lot of college coaches out there that are saying they're not benefiting from it, from having to sit there all weekend. And so I'm going to kind of throw this back to you because I know you have a lot of thoughts on this, but I kind of want to go from that idea of like, if I'm in Ruston, Louisiana, why do I feel like I have to go to Cincinnati to get a certain level of experience when the kids that are in Cincinnati feel like they got to come all the way down here to Ruston to get a certain kind of experience, when in reality, we could just kind of stay where we are and get everything we need and more if we were willing to do that, quote unquote, right.
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head for the last like 2 minutes. And yeah, I think a lot of it is event operators are benefiting the most from it. And I think it's in a good spirit of saying like, yeah, look, we're providing an opportunity and it's up to you to take the opportunity, but you also have to be able to pay for this opportunity. And I think with things like scholastic periods now, that's probably one of the best things that's happened to this model because it does allow you to stay local. It does allow you to play with people who are in your backyard. It does allow you to play against teams and play against players that you would see anyway. And so it provides also a lot more context to the college coach about the competition you're playing for the majority of the year. And so, we just had our first one in girls and women's basketball. Now, me being up here in New England and having these prep schools and stuff, I mean, it was a tremendous, tremendous event. Shout out to another one of our EC fam, Io Hart, over at Sacred Heart Greenwich for hosting a great event. But realistically, like a lot of those players we have seen play on their AAU teams. We've seen them play club. Being a college coach in New England, like you see all these kids playing with their club teams, and you never, ever get to see them with their high school teams. And then you see it for a weekend, and you're like, man, these kids can go. And they play totally differently in this context than they do in the context where their team is just slapped together and they're just going to go play 8 games in a weekend. The context was totally different. And we didn't have to travel that far. Our drive was like 3 hours long. As opposed to in a few weeks when like Run for Roses happens, and you're going to have people coming from Massachusetts, people coming from Vermont, Maine, whatever, California, and they're descending on Kentucky for the largest indoor event in the country that has 85 courts. And you're going to have kids who have paid or not kids, but families who have paid tens of thousands of dollars. And they're going to be playing on court 85 at 8 in the morning for 3 days straight. And not one college coach is going to be on their court. And they may not even touch the floor. And so how that helps that person, how that helps that team, how that helps that kid who may have an inkling of wanting to play college sports or just even wanting to get better. How does that help that kid? I would assert that the only way that helps that kid, and this is me like channeling my inner Joshua Medcalf right now. All right. And really in a saccharine way being like, there's got to be some benefit to this. It may indirectly teach that kid to have some active patience and to have a little bit of willpower to like not complain about it. But they are the ones who have put themselves in that situation, or their parents put themselves in that situation, thinking that they had to keep up with the Joneses and win the Christmas party. Just to be able to say like, oh yeah, my kid plays on XYZ team that literally like nobody watches. And if they do, they're not watching you. And so that leads to a couple of questions. Like this pay to play model, I think we can have a separate conversation about sort of the gentrification of sport in general, right? With the ability to just pay to play, like anyone can have an experience in AAU, but like, what are the common things we see and hear? And I'm curious what you hear down there, because here, and I think I heard this in Virginia as well, and I think even in Maryland, like even when I coached AAU, I was an assistant coach for like 4 teams in one organization. Our practices weren't special, like there was no real learning happening. The practices were a vehicle for somebody to grow their individual training business. Up here, what's being reported is like, man, we just run for like an hour and a half. And we might play 5-on-5 after, but we're so tired from running that the 5-on-5 is terrible. So then we blow the whistle and we run more. But that's supposed to prepare you for college basketball? Like, you're paying all this money for that. And I always ask the question, like, man, y'all pay for that? And again, it's painting with a broad brush. Like, I think there are some coaches that do it the right way. And I think there's some coaches that are like really doing it for the kids and they're really benefiting from it. And the kids get better over the summer. I'm not knocking any of that. But I think by and large, when you have a very small percentage of players who are actually ready for that level of exposure, and the larger percentage are kids that really have no business being there. And this is something that I think AAU directors would agree about. Like, and this is the kind of the catch-22 for them is like, yeah, I agree that that player is not ready for exposure, but they've paid to play. They want to have a certain experience, and so we're going to give them that experience without any sort of understanding of like what that experience actually entails and what the expectations should be. So then when the expectations aren't managed properly, what happens? And this is your favorite word, it's entropy. But we don't have enough time over the summer, nor is there enough continuity over the summer to really sort out that entropy. And so what we've done is then we've created a pretty unstable system that can never really reach the homeostasis that we want it to. I have a few other things, but I've been talking for a little while. I'm curious what you think about any of those things and what you have to add to that, because I think I could go on for days about how this has sort of adulterated what the youth sport experience should be.
Well, again, not to say all of this is so bad, because like down here, there are more opportunities than there used to be. And I do think that's a good thing. And I do think that there are people, and I know people that are doing this for a lot of those, the quote unquote right reasons, right? Kids have benefited from some of these things. I don't think either one of us is saying that there's not any sort of good that comes from this. But looking at the by and large, 30,000 foot view, I feel like a lot of the exposure is coming at the expense of the development. That there should be a level of development first before you're ready to sort of graduate, to that. And, I kind of hate to like throw this back to a playmakers thing necessarily, but like the way those curricula are written is you don't even play 3-on-3 until you're ready to play, like quote unquote, ready to play 3-on-3. There are certain foundational things that we want to get to make sure that that experience is sort of lived to the fullest. And I feel like that's sort of what happens with this is we're rushing to the exposure and we're skipping steps 1 through 9. And we're just jumping, we're past go to collect $200, but we haven't gone through, all the other spaces along the board. We feel like we can just sort of jump the line and cheat our way to that. And we're just praying that we happen to throw in a couple of threes in front of one college coach, and then that'll fix my journey. And then that journey is now over because I'm going to get a scholarship and that's all I've ever had to do. When in reality, the entropy of that exercise is you eventually will get exposed because you're going to show up at college campus next fall and you're not going to belong, or you're going to get exposed eventually. And I just feel like we're, to sound like the old guys on the lawn again, like society these days, nobody wants to work for anything. We just want the quick fix. We want to basically buy and do whatever we have to for instant success. But you can't cheat the work. You can't skip all of the necessary, bumps and bruises and failures and twists and turns in the road and all that to get where you need to go. But everybody's in such a rush to get here. It's painted as if the only way to get there is to take this particular path. And then you're just praying that the entropy doesn't catch you in time and you're one of the lucky ones that sort of gets through. But for most of the players and the kids involved in this process, like you said, they don't ever even see a college coach at some of these things, much less a college coach see them. And then why are we going? Like, well, I know I'm not going to play college ball. I'm just kind of there for that experience. And it's like, okay, I get that. But do you need to do that every single weekend at the expense of all these other things? Like, you're basically giving up your entire summer as a kid.
Mm-hmm.
And something my wife and I talked about not too long ago, Kendall being 7 years old, her hanging out with me at work a lot. Like, it's hard having her at work because I can't fully focus on her. I can't fully focus on work, but like I'm trying to enjoy the moments that I get with her. And this like almost sort of like really sad thought. Like, you get 18 summers with your kid.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's it. And then they're gone. They're all doing other things. And if this is how like you as a parent choose to spend your summer with your kid, then great. There's nothing wrong with that at all. If that's the reason that you're doing it, right? Like, if this is how you're sort of choosing to spend that time, like, to each his own. But we don't hear a lot of those stories. You know what I mean? It's what is this event going to do for me? And how is it going to help me, sort of promote myself or my brand and get me where I need to go at the expense of all these other things? Meanwhile, you have your high school programs, you're having high school practices, you're having high school team camps, you're having high school summer league games, and all of that is sort of getting the short end of the stick because we have to prioritize this other experience over, again, sort of the be where your feet are experience back at home.
And I'm not sure, like I want the listeners to understand too. I don't think it's a high school versus grassroots thing. Right. I think it can be a high school and grassroots or a high school or grassroots, but to prioritize one at the expense of the other and say, well, we have this thing coming up in a couple weeks and I don't want to, overdo it here with that. Like okay, first of all, you're probably not going to overdo it. And where you're going to do it or where you are going to overdo it is likely at the place where the basketball education is not what it should be. And, you can have your opinion on where that is, but by and large, most high school coaches are doing the best with what they know how, and they're trying to develop because they have to run a program, right? They're not just trying to win games in the summer. They are trying to run something sustainable. And many of them, and I will give high school coaches their due always, many of them are trying to develop themselves. If you just are coaching club or grassroots or something like that, and you are not investing in growing yourself and having better practices and having a true player development philosophy that isn't just work harder, nobody cares, get better, and all of these things that we see paraded around on social media, like, I just don't see how that value is apparent for all the players. And when we think of an equity conversation, like you're taking kids and you might have practice like twice a week for an hour. How are you helping all those kids get better at the things they're going to need to be good at for when college basketball comes calling? Right? You and I both talk to college basketball coaches on a daily basis. Right? Daily basis. And what do most of them say? And this goes directly to this question that I was asking. What are players learning? Most of them say players come in and have to spend a year unlearning everything they've learned. Or some version of that. And there's always this inherent conflict. And I think I found this the most probably in Virginia, with a few players on my last roster in Virginia, where high school basketball was free and coaches made very little money coaching high school basketball. Why should I trust you if you don't make a lot of money doing this? I pay my trainer $150 an hour. I'm going to trust what my trainer says over what you have to say, even though what my trainer says does not help our team win. So that whole concept of the pay to play model, is this for everybody? We've established that it's not. It's for very few, actually. And what are players learning? I think it depends on the situation. And I think it depends on the continuity of that situation. I think there's a lot of kids that are realizing that the coach that yells at you a lot and makes you run and all of that stuff, like it might look good and it might look like it's good coaching and that it's hard and that you're going to be challenged and all of these things. But when that college coach comes calling and they call your high school coach and they say, man, I watched her do things in that game, or I watched him do things with you that I've never seen them do in a year of watching them with their club team, because they're playing real basketball. I don't think there's even an AAU director out there, and this might get me in trouble, but I don't really care. Like, I don't think there's an AAU director out there that can say our grassroots experience in the leagues and stuff that we play in is real, high level, looks like basketball. I think it is in spurts. But I think when you think about organized, competitive basketball, nothing about the grassroots experience simulates that. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, I think it's hard to, like you said, you can in spurts, but it's not about doing something one time. It's about sustaining it. And that's what you're going to get from more of a year-round program. And again, there are great grassroots programs that do a lot of
great
things.
Grassroots programs. Nobody on this podcast is saying that the grassroots thing is wrong, right, or that inherently it's bad, right? That is not what we're talking about.
But when you're fighting that entropy word, and in the transient nature of sport and kids coming and going and leaving, and you're on kids are on 3 teams and they're going from one tournament to the next, and this kid played for this program and now they're over there. It's a nightmare for a program director or a coach to even try to put a semblance of something like that together, because it just environmentally, the situation doesn't really lend itself to that. That's where I feel like the development piece becomes extremely difficult, because you just don't, development takes time.
Mm-hmm.
And you could say,
time
well,
and
this
continuity.
This team here plays really great basketball because they've got these. It's like, okay, yeah, they got like 5 of the best guys in the country. Mm-hmm. So what they do is going to look pretty good. But how many programs have the 5 best players in the country on it? Like, you don't have that for us in our context, at our levels and all this and that. What's sort of more the norm, that's not going to be the case. And yeah, at the highest level, at Run for the Roses on court 1, Gino's sitting there watching that player. Mm-hmm. But this stuff trickles all the way down to 9, 10, 8, 7 years old.
I mean, think about that video of like that second grade team just absolutely trash talking their opponents and like doing the too small thing. You know what I'm talking about? That overtime video. So those kids went on like a little tour for exposure, right? And they went and played a team from my area, the DMV, and they got clapped. It was like 46-7. You think they were doing the too small thing then? Absolutely not. Right? So they got exposed. And that's exactly what this is.
And it's happening in, again, I know I've mentioned this on like another podcast, but like Kendall's classmates and like 6 and 7 years old, like won the softball World Series for Louisiana. And it's like, do we need a 6-year-old softball World Series?
Yeah, of
who's
course.
really winning at that point, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And even if it's not it's the parents that are winning, because their kids are doing something. And like you said, they're winning the Christmas party and they feel good about it. And it's great to post it on Facebook, and it's great to see your kid do this, great to see your kid do that. But again, a lot of times at that age, is it development, or is it the team that has the 7.5-year-olds that beat the teams that has the 6.5-year-olds? You know, what's really the difference there? And so for the people that are listening to this, I feel like our small niche audience, that is into the quote unquote, right reasons of developing the next generation of leaders and wanting to produce great players and character and development and leadership and blah, 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 all that stuff. The question that I'm just sort of simply posing to is like, where are we going to get that most likely? And how do we get there? And again, not saying that one is wrong and one is right, but what are sort of our current situation? What do we take from it that we think is working well? What are some things that aren't working so well? And how do we skew it back towards the other end? If we're really in it for the next generation of great whatever kids, players, leaders, whatever, how are we going about developing that?
Well, so I think that leads into some of the next few points here of things that I had written down in the pre-work for this particular episode. Like, I think it's really important that we have to answer the question of why are we doing this? Right? At a very basic level, like we have talked about parents winning the Christmas party. That's not going to change, right? Until there's maybe a new generation of parents with different priorities, but it just seems like it's getting worse and worse and worse. Right? I want to celebrate my kid. I don't want them to struggle. I don't want there to be this, I want to make sure they're playing in the right bracket and on the right team. And I'm not going to do this unless I know it's going to be perfect for them. And like realistically, it's just not going to be perfect for them. And you can switch teams. You can go for a new coach. You can do all of those things. But at some point, when all of those external excuses are gone, you are going to have to put up. And you are going to have to be the one that gets exposed or gets exposure for how good you are. And so when we think about like, why are we doing this? By and large, there is that societal pressure, but this is just the model that's been popularized. It's the system that exists. And so systems can be made, systems can be unmade. And so when we think about like alternatives to this, because you never want to come with a complaint unless you have a solution, right? That's the rule. The very easy solution to this, shameless plug, is something like Playmakers, where there can be exposure, but the main point is development. Where there can be evaluation happening, but the main point is learning. And then eventually, you can qualify to go play in an exposure tournament or something like that. You should not, and this is where I really like, as somebody who did not get to do this as a young person, like it existed, but my parents didn't know about it. I don't think you should just be able to sign up for a team and there should be these like teams everywhere sprouting up that can all just go enter these tournaments to see what happens. I just don't believe that that's a sustainable model. It doesn't make sense to me that that's a thing. Furthermore, it should be taken into account the level at which you play in the scholastic setting. If you did not make the varsity team as a freshman, sophomore, junior, you probably shouldn't be calling yourself elite. Like, you just shouldn't. You should not be on a team that is calling itself elite. Very, very few players and teams are actually elite. You are not a star. You are not diamond. You are none of those things. You are just another kid who hoops and wants to play. And there is nothing wrong with that.
Absolutely nothing wrong with that.
There is nothing wrong with that. Come play Playmakers. We'll get you ready to go play for that Stars elite team. You will walk out of there as a better player. One that can go help a college program because you are a universal player. You know what the best way is to overcome the excuse of, well, we like our guards to be 6'4", but he's only 6'1". Be more skilled than the 6'4" guy. Be more tenacious going after the boards than the 5'10" kid. Where do you learn to do that stuff? Do you learn to do that stuff in grassroots? Maybe. Go play 21 at the park with the guys who are 10 years older than you. That's how you're going to learn to go after the glass, because otherwise you're never going to touch the ball. But if I'm constantly playing in my age group, or maybe even a couple years up, in the name of exposure, again, that's what this episode is about. It is not about what's right or wrong in terms of grassroots and stuff like that. That could be a totally different episode. What we are talking about is the student athlete experience in these exposure versus exposing events. What are you learning doing that? Who is this actually for? Why are we actually doing this? And what it comes down to is players spend an entire summer where they have no school, they have nothing going on, and they get looped into these activities, and it takes up the majority of their time. And when you look back at the return on the investment, what do you have to show for it? And not saying that you have a return on investment in all of your high school programs and stuff like that. I mean, it varies from place to place, situation to situation. But by and large, when we're thinking about the percentage of players who go to an event outside their home area, we'll use Run for Roses as an example because it's the biggest one, right? There's going to be 10,000 players there. How many roster spots even exist in a college basketball, on a college basketball roster? Do we know? It's not 10,000. Is it? It's definitely not 10,000. And not 10,000 at a time to where all of those players can find a spot to play. And that's just one event that's happening. So if you think like 2% of high school athletes play college sports, what happens to the other 98% that are on that same path as that other 2%? And they're doing the same thing as that other 2%, not realizing they're not part of the 2%. How many people are reflective enough to know they are part of the 98% that they need to maybe do something differently to try to enter that top 2%? Because I'll tell you, like, it is a depressing sight, and I've been there. And my own kids have done it. My own players have been the ones on court 85 at 8 in the morning at USJN DC at the Gaylord Hotel in Washington DC at the National Harbor, and there's not nary one college coach on their court because they were in the wrong bracket. Their game time was inconvenient, and they weren't playing anybody that anybody else wanted to see either. And yet they paid the same amount of money as everybody else for the same promise that college coaches would be there to watch them. And here they are getting exposed at 8 o'clock in the morning, and thank God nobody saw it except for me.
I mean, you said the word reflective, and that's what I had written down here, kind of as probably my last point for tonight. Was the alignment and the congruence beyond the proposed experience and the actual experience, and which of those are more aligned. So like, yeah, in these exposure type of events, we're promising you a certain level of experience, and what actually do we get, the return on that investment, as you said. And so I guess kind of the last point I want to make is it's not that you should or shouldn't do one of these events, but when you're backing up one event after another, to me, it's not the event itself, it's what's happening in between them. It's the Raka process and the reflection and the awareness that we're creating of what we got out of that experience. And it's just so hard to do in such a short amount of time with so much going on, to take the time to do that, because you've got to develop, you've got to travel, you've got games, you've got your high school stuff, you've got all this, you've got all that. That is just not naturally, I don't think, baked into the process of, hey, let's sit down and talk about what we got out of last weekend. Let's talk about what last weekend meant for us as a program, as a team, as a a grassroots unit. What did that do for you as a player? What did that do for me as a coach? That we don't have time for that, because we got to get ready for the next thing. And so it's not to say that, again, these things are bad or you shouldn't do them, but it's what is sort of the Raka ability in between these things that are allowing that to happen. And I think if you had to compare the two, you're going to get more of that from your high school program, hometown program, development program, because that's part of their goal, is to go through that reflective process and think about and talk about, and maybe break down film or talk about practice or have a team meeting or whatever, where, again, just in the natural sort of rhythm of trying to get from one event to the next, that stuff, I feel like, can get very easily lost in the shuffle. And again, if you're listening to this and you're going, no, my program has what, then again, great. But realistically, how many of these 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old events is that a priority? And even if it is a priority, how is it being done well? And well enough to be considered worth that return on the investment versus a more local alternative where the kids might be a little bit more at the forefront of that particular experience.